Here we are, week 5 of Psych 31, Introduction to Abnormal Psychology. This module, we're going to study the disorders of trauma and stress, which are from chapter 6 of the textbook we're using. And by way of a brief introduction, let me just say the stress reactions and the sense of fear that they can produce are often at play in several different psychological disorders. People who experience a large number of stressful events are particularly vulnerable to the onset of anxiety disorders, the ones you read about in the previous chapter. And stress plays an even more central role in the psychological disorders of acute stress disorder and the post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. And this module will focus on the brain and body's reaction to stress. You know, the book in the first couple of pages gives a really quick overview of stress physiology, but I don't think it's sufficient enough for you. So I'm going to do a quick review of the physiology, the neurophysiology of stress, because it's only then that we can appreciate the disorders of trauma and stress. That's the plan. So you remember from Psych 1, probably the most complex and highly organized system in the body is the nervous system. And the nervous system receives information from the sensory organs about the internal environment and the external environment and transmits that information via nerves to the spinal cord, and then it processes it into the brain. The nervous system really directs our body's reaction to the world we're a part of and also controls most of the internal functions, everything from muscle movement, heart rate, blood pressure, yes, the stress response, and much, much more. So also from your Psych 1 readings, the nervous system is divided into two sections: the brain and spinal cord, or the central nervous system, and the sensory organs that make up the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is divided into two major parts, the autonomic and the somatic nervous systems. And the autonomic nervous system has three divisions: the sympathetic division, which controls the fight or take flight response during stress and emergencies, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which in non-emergency stressful situation controls the routine housekeeping functions of the body. And then the enteric division, which provides local control of the digestive system. And when studying the physiology of stress, we look at the autonomic nervous system's sympathetic division. Lots of stress in our environment. The goal of life is not to avoid stress. That would be impossible. We also call that death. But stress is not all bad. Hans Selye called it eustress, which is positive stress. The stress of giving a performance, giving a speech, that first date, taking an exam. And then there's not so good stress. Episodic acute stress and chronic stress. But stress is all around us, and thank God we have a sympathetic nervous system that helps us manage and get through that. So at our most basic biological level is the fundamental need for safety and survival. As human beings, our primary responsibility is to stay alive. So it would make sense that our ability to protect ourselves from any threat would be governed by a system that's automatic, reflexive, and fast. Enter the autonomic nervous system through the sympathetic division. Sympathetic nervous system activation is really a stress response. When a perceived threat is present, a chemical message is sent to the adrenal glands to secrete adrenaline and cortisol. These are natural chemicals or hormones our body produces to give us a momentary, if not somewhat superhuman strength, so that we can run from a dangerous situation, we can fight to preserve our life, or freeze, remaining really still as to not be seen by a predator. The autonomic nervous system is most important in two ways: in emergencies that cause stress and require us to fight or take flight, sympathetic response, or in non-emergencies that allow us to rest and digest, parasympathetic. And here's an example. As you drive into a parking lot, a young boy on a skateboard suddenly flies in front of your car across your field of vision. You see the boy in the nick of time and react immediately. You slam on the brakes and steer sharply to the right, all in the blink of an eye. You avoid a collision, but just barely. You're shaken up, but thankfully no one was hurt. How did you respond so quickly? Such rapid responses are controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. But how does it work? Well, it works by, first of all, a perception that there's a danger or a threat. And that is usually processed by the amygdala in the brain that signals the hypothalamus to start its job of preparing the body through the autonomic nervous system and pituitary gland to set the body up for fast, accurate response. So we'll go over that in a minute, but Hans Selye, kind of the grandfather of formal research and study into stress, reminds us that it's not the stress that kills us, it's our reaction to it. Stress is always going to be around, but how we react to it is how we survive best. The state of stress has two components. It's the stressor, which is the actual event that creates danger, threats, or the perception of such. And then the stress response, which is our reaction to the stressor. And the stress response usually occurs at three levels: emotionally, physiologically, and behaviorally. So when we view a stressor as threatening, the natural reaction is arousal and fear. That's a fundamental biological process that helps in our survival. When someone confronts a danger, the eyes or ears, or usually both, send the information to the brain's amygdala. And that's an area that contributes to emotional processing. The amygdala interprets the images and sounds, and when it perceives danger, it instantly sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus. After the amygdala sends a distress signal, the hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system by sending signals to the autonomic nerves to the adrenal glands. These glands respond by pumping the hormone epinephrine into the bloodstream. All of these changes happen so quickly that people aren't even aware of them sometimes. In fact, the wiring is so efficient that the amygdala and the hypothalamus start this cascade of chemical events even before the brain's visual centers have had a chance to fully process what's happening. That's why people are able to jump out of the path of an oncoming car even before they think about what they're doing. And to exemplify that, let me show you this quick video about that example. Now here you have two young women who are crossing the street on a green light. Looking both ways, perfect, crossing the street. And these two cars collide into each other and careen towards the two young women. She immediately jumps out of the way and avoids being struck. So a good example of describing that sympathetic response, we're able to deploy fast, accurate response almost immediately, and then after the danger is over, your brain can kind of catch up and think about what just happened. So there are two brain-body pathways in responding to stress, both activated by the hypothalamus, and they control our physiological responses to stress. The first pathway is routed through the autonomic nervous system and involves the activation of the central adrenal glands in a part of the adrenal gland called the adrenal medulla. And it releases catecholamines of epinephrine and norepinephrine, adrenaline-like substances. These substances mobilize the body for action, fight, or take flight. The second pathway is from the brain to the endocrine system and involves the pituitary gland, which stimulates outer adrenal glands, another part of the adrenal gland called the adrenal cortex, which it releases corticosteroids that increase cortisol levels, that increase the body's response to the stressor. And you can see how close proximity the hypothalamus is to the pituitary gland. So close they call it the hypothalamus-pituitary axis, or the hypax. They work very, very closely together. So when you put it all together, a stressor is perceived, and the body starts to react. The amygdala that detected the stressor, that there's danger or threat involved, signals the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus essentially wakes up the pituitary gland by releasing corticotropic hormone, or CRH, sometimes corticotropic releasing factor. And that stimulates the pituitary gland to release a hormone called adrenal corticotropic hormone. And ACTH moves through the blood into the adrenal gland, which activates it to release cortisol. And cortisol prepares the whole body for a reaction or response to stress. Remember now, the hypothalamus also activates the adrenal medulla to release catecholamines, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, which starts the fight, flight, or fright response. Interestingly, too, is that cortisol, which initiates the stress response by activating multiple systems of the body for stress response, is the same corticosteroid that, when it circulates back through the brain, shuts it off. So cortisol facilitates the stress response, but is also the same hormone that stops the stress response. So according to the American Psychological Association, there's 3 types of stress: acute stress, episodic acute stress, and chronic stress. And they can all make us feel out of sorts or even ill. However, and most unfortunately, chronic stress is often ignored. Acute stress is when you're behind on a seemingly all-important deadline, and then you get a call from your child's school asking you to stop what you're doing and come by. Or you barely miss a serious car accident, as we saw in the video clip. Then there's episodic acute stress, and some people will experience many crises regularly and live in a state of tension. These are a cohort that's vulnerable to anxiety disorders, or to the onset of anxiety disorders. They may be taking on too much or simply be overburdened by their lives. And then the third type of stress, probably the most toxic, is chronic stress. And this is the grinding stress that wears us down over the years. It arises from serious life problems that may be fundamentally beyond our control. And examples of chronic stress would be poverty, war, or racism. So it's from this brief overview, I'm hoping that you'll be able to understand better the physiology of stress, basically, so that you can appreciate what happens when somebody has a disorder of stress or trauma. Thanks a lot.